kind of a sad week, or a sad last week in the art world, because David Hockney died last week, and it's kind of a sad week, but I think it's also kind of, in some ways, a happy week, because the way he left us was in a way that I think everybody would want to go, in that he lived an extremely full life doing what he loved and mastered it and was celebrated for it and was doing it right up until the end. And so, obviously, it's always sad when someone goes, but if you get to go like David Hockney went, then you have to have a sort of faint smile at the back, don't you? And a sort of hope that you're lucky enough to receive a similar hand in some ways, I guess. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. A little bit about David Hockney, but not in my more researchy way where I'm flashing up paintings and stuff. I'm not going to research him more than what's in my head, and that's how I think I want to represent him. I wasn't like the biggest fan of David Hockney. I certainly was aware of his work and paintings and am to an extent, but I'll talk about a little bit about what I know about him, and then in that sense, even for someone who hasn't spent their time looking deeply at him, we can see what a sort of broad and wide sort of effect he had on everybody in at least Britain and England and throughout the world, I guess. To some extent, he was also well known in America for his work in America. And we're going to do that in a relaxed kind of way while we look at the paintings I'm going to do this week. Now, last week I essentially finished this one, and the painting I'm doing this week is a continuation of that. And one reason it's a continuation anyway, is because it's on this A3 card that I've been doing. And another reason it's a continuation is because of the techniques I've been using. The colours are quite different, aren't they? I've still got this yellow in there. I always seem to be throwing yellow in everything. That's interesting. But I suppose it's because it is being done in similar phases to how I did this one. So this one had what I would call a sort of initial attack phase, where I just went at it with sort of black paint and knitting needles and sort of laid out a really rough outline of what I wanted it to be. And then the middle phase, I guess, is where we are today with this one, where I've sort of done an attack phase there myself. I used a small blade for this one and just put down the colours I wanted in a way I wanted it, with a broad sort of guess of a landscape, I suppose. And today I'm going to do the middle bit, where I'm just going to put it in a bit more to make it more like a landscape, I guess. And put in some rough and broad bits of paint to allow us to do what the last phase would be, which was what I did last week on this one, where I used hairs to create the sort of details at the front. And then we'll be doing that on this painting after we've done the middle phase. And so I think to get started, we will get some paint and just start painting it out and seeing what I think about David's life and work. Can I call him David? I wouldn't call him Mr. Hockney, but David Hockney's life and work. So I'm going to start with some burnt sienna, and I'm going to put that in these middle areas here, loosely with this sort of medium-sized brush. I'm going to put a little bit onto here and just dampen it down a bit and try and thin it out with a bit of water, just so it can run quite translucently and freely across the painting. So David Hockney, how do I know David Hockney? The first sort of thing I can say about him is, and the reason he connects to me in some way, is that he is from the north of England, from Bradford. And I was born in the north of England, not as far north as Bradford. And although I had a Yorkshire postcode growing up, I wasn't quite in Yorkshire, just on the edge, but he's a Yorkshireman, and that's played a large part in his career, especially his later career, where he sort of returned to massive perspective-driven landscapes and things like that, and murals. And he sort of fulfilled the dream of many a northern person of a certain desire, and that is to go to art college. Now, I don't know for a fact, I think he went down to art college in London. I don't know that. He could have done it up in Bradford, or maybe both. But it's certainly, I mean, Barbara Hepworth is another one, isn't she? She's from Wakefield, and she went down to St Ives, and in some ways sort of left her northernness behind a little bit, but less so, I think, with David Hockney. And after he'd sort of done his initial training, I guess he went to America, and that's where he did his sort of initial paintings, which probably made a name for him, and they were in some ways banal and reminded me a little bit of, say, Edward Hopper, these very quiet scenes where you're not quite sure what's going on with the people in them and everything seems a bit subdued. They also remind me of the photographer William Eggleston, in there's sort of this Americana to it that's got a slightly depressive background to it. Almost, I wouldn't say an anxiety, almost like a, what's the word, when you've been on some kind of tranquilizer or something, like a tranquilized vibe to it. And he uses these sort of pastel and soft pinks and blues, and probably the most famous painting in relation to that is A Bigger Splash, where it's just like that someone's jumped in the off a diving board. You can't actually see them, they've gone under and there's a splash, and then there's this very sort of banal, what looks like maybe a Florida, Miami type architecture in the background, all done with very good perspective and a high amount of, let's say, formality and rigor in terms of how sharp everything is, almost architectural. And that's where I first sort of, I took note of that, and I certainly liked it, and it had some effect on me, and I did enjoy that aspect of his painting, and he certainly did make a name for himself out there, but then returned and had a brief foray into another area in which is sort of relevant to my art journey, which is digital art. Well, it wasn't a brief foray because he continued doing it all the way up until his passing, I guess. And he was one of the first people to ever do any digital art. There's a video you can probably find on YouTube where some of the guys have made the first like digital art package on a computer, and they asked David Hockney to come in and do some art on it, and he sort of sits there and scribbles away. Creates this very, now what we'd describe as very sort of low resolution and to some degree poor image, and they all sort of applaud him in amazement at what he's done, which now in retrospect is sort of almost like smirk at slightly, but I think at the time it was definitely very sort of relevant to what was going on with computers. And of course you have to remember how amazed we all were when computers first came out, in like when you could get your hands on a home computer in the 80s, and you know, you were playing sort of low resolution games, and you'd add your own imagination into them. You'd be playing these tiny pixels and it'd seem somehow real. And I think to some degree that's probably how it related back into that, and how people were so impressed with him in that little video. But he sort of carried that on and was famous for his iPad art, and in some ways therefore democratizing art as well, I think. And I sort of came to art through photography, and he did photography as well, and I think you can see that in his compositions and the way that the perspectives work, that he'd got a photographer's eye. And I started off in digital photography, that's how I came to art in general, really. And I then moved into digital art, and the reason I started painting, apart from a dream that I actually had that told me to start painting, and the fact that I was interested in it, but one of the main reasons I turned to it more seriously was because of sort of the onset of AI, and me believing that that's kind of it for digital art in some ways. Like, I better pivot to something that, so I can't even hold it, something that a robot can't do quite yet. Maybe one day we'll be able to do, or some kind of artificial life form that we create. But at the moment, it's just us in the painting game, so to speak. So that's kind of how I find my way there. So there's some sort of effect, I feel, that he's had. My awareness of what he was doing must have played to some degree a role in how I sort of pursued and felt like reciprocally noted that I'm like, oh, there's somebody in the art world doing the same kind of things that I am. So it did have an effect on me in that way, I guess. Right, where are we with this? So I've put in a little bit of brown up there, brown we'll call it, very technical, burnt sienna, we'll just call it brown. I think a little bit, I think this foreground here, I'm going to have more as a sort of watery area. I think I'll just put a bit in here, like that, and try and smear that in as well. Not be too precise about it. Try and get a bit in there, down there. Now, a lot of the time I just set the camera up above so you could see this, but I'm just pushed for time, so I just do it this way for now, and the channel does continue to grow, you know, and once it gets bigger and I can sort of justify investing, you know, the bigger the channel gets, the more time I can invest into it, because I don't have to justify it so much to myself and others as to like how much of a potential waste of time it is. In some ways it is, you know, when you've got other things to be doing, but in other ways it's definitely not. However, the more people that subscribe and watch and like and all that, the more I can invest into these videos, and the more I'll probably feel motivated to do so. But today I'm just going to like sort of show it you and chat at the camera as we go. I think we need to add the next colour then, so I'm going to add some blue down here. Cyan, primary cyan is what I want. I'm going to give the brush a wash and then we can do that. So what else do I know about David Hockney's paintings? So I know that perspective was very important in his work, and his later works were sort of more back in the English and Yorkshire countryside, and he'd use massive paintings and take different almost panels to create them from different perspectives. So a little bit like maybe the work of Cézanne and stuff like that. So we do see some relation back to the sort of modern art in that area with Cézanne, and some of his figures and the way he paints them are certainly done in a Cézanne and Impressionist style, but also a little bit of style of earlier Picasso and things like that. So he's definitely always been understanding of art history and nodding back to it in his work and pushing it forwards. And I do think in some ways he is like the end of that, the official story of art history as understood through sort of the European academics' eyes, I suppose, which may or may not, well, probably almost definitely isn't an accurate representation of how art has panned out through history, but there's certainly definitely a story of how it went from one thing to the next, culminating up to maybe street art and pop art, and then where we are now. And in some ways David Hockney, born in 1937, sort of has finished that off in some ways and put a full stop on it, because I think with the exception of maybe Banksy, I struggle to name somebody who's so mainstream that you can just put them into that narrative. And I think now what we're going to have is more going forward is how society is much more of a mosaic, broken down little niches of people operating within all the niches, and sort of gather it together and try and tell a story of art as one sort of narrative through time would be inaccurate and also sort of counterproductive in a way. It's not really how it is anymore, but you could argue, of course, that it never really was like that. It's just a select few historians and academics and press and people who are interested in creating fame and fortune or whatever have colluded together to create that story of art. But whatever you think about that story of art, he's definitely, in my opinion, right there at the end of it as a central figure. And I suppose in that sense, at least, an important figure as well. Sort of like following on from like Francis Bacon and things like that as well. And his work is interesting though, because he didn't sort of have the rage and anger of somebody like Francis Bacon, and in some ways it didn't even have, like, if you look at Picasso and how sort of scandalous in some ways his work was, it didn't really have that. And of course another reason David Hockney was well known was because of his sexuality and things like that. But in the way I viewed him, I never really, unless I'm naive, I couldn't really see that in his work and in his sort of life story and that kind of thing. You know, people, his relationships never really came up. So in some ways, he was just a painter. It was all about the painting, and that often is the case for many a painter. It is just all about the painting and not a lot else. But I think even within his work, I struggle to see where maybe, you know, romance and sexuality and lust and all that figure in it. If it is, it's very well masked out in the background and very much for a subtle eye, and maybe an eye that I don't have in that sense. And that's quite interesting as well. And that's why I sort of put his work down as sort of operating his initial early work in a sort of banal and like I say, that sort of tranquilized way. And that's not to put it down. It's a very interesting and cool aesthetic. Let's put some blue in here while we're chatting. And something that relates quite well, I think, also to sort of post Andy Warhol and things like that, and sort of following on from that as well. So it is interesting in that aspect. And then his sort of more landscapey stuff is, in some ways, it's one of these ideas of a celebration of sort of British culture, maybe, I don't know. It's definitely an exercise in the execution of painting and art and technique and things like that, and how things are done with perspective. So in that way, very sort of an artist but also appealing mainstream to the public as well. And you know, a landscape can just be a landscape that you like. It doesn't necessarily have to have some massive social commentary, I guess. And but what he definitely did it with the eye of a painter. He very much, I guess, was, and sort of to the fullest extent, was a painter. I put a big blue streak across here. Don't know if I really intended to do that. That's changed it quite a lot. But maybe I don't mind it. I'll stick with it. It's definitely divided it up into sort of 3, maybe 4 different bits, which is kind of interesting. I might just try and blend it a bit underneath. And yeah, I guess that's kind of that's where I stand with David Hockney and what I know about him. And without sitting down and looking through every painting and following this to that and this and that, that's just how his existence pervaded into me. And I suppose just by discussing that and mentioning that, I can sort of reflect a little bit about how important he must have been, in that I didn't particularly go out of my way to find out about him or his life, yet he found a way into mine. And that's a cool thing, isn't it? And it's definitely something that most people are not aware of doing. We probably all do that to some extent, don't we? But we're probably not ever aware of it. But I think he must have been, on some sense, aware of it because of his fame. Does this wipe off? Because in some ways I'd like to sort of wipe it off a bit as well. That's not too bad. Pull it this way and try and create a bit of perspective ourselves. Let's think Hockney ourselves. And get a tiny bit here. Let's just see what happens if we just put some drizzles on like that, I guess. Since we've got some paint left, try and use it. So, you know, let me know if you have any sort of celebratory thoughts on Hockney's life, and it certainly does sort of feel like an end of an era, doesn't it? In many ways, I think once Attenborough leaves us, that'll kind of just be it. The book will be closed and we'll be heading into a totally new era, because these guys who have been sort of creating 20th century culture have lived very, very long lives, haven't they? They're super impressive. Dick Van Dyke as well, he's still out there. It's amazing. And of course Shatner, how can we forget Shatner? So time has passed and I've finished for today anyway. This is what I've got. This is what I've sort of done. So this has turned quite watery at the front, and then I've put some sort of more detail into the mid areas. Then a little bit orange coming in on the sides of the sky. Trying to follow a similar idea to before and not putting too much upon the sky, and then doing more down here. And then I guess if we are going to do more detail in terms of hair again, we could try just doing something curls or something with the water. That'll either totally wreck it or make it better, I don't know. But then obviously some kind of vegetation up here, I guess, is another option. So I'll have a muse and a think over that over the next week and decide what I'm going to do, or just do it. I'll probably not decide anything until I sit down. Anyway, so next week's video may be a milestone. I have got 497 subscribers at the minute, and that means I might hit 500 next week. And in a sort of ironic and comical way, I guess, I thought I might do an Ask Me Anything for 500 subscribers. So I'll pin a comment down in the bottom of this video and you can leave your question there. Ask me anything, literally anything. And I'll probably do a community post as well once I hit 500. And if I get more than 2 questions, i.e. 3, then I'll do the video for a bit of a laugh really, and a thank you to the 500 people and or bots that have decided to click subscribe to this channel. And most of the success of this channel is, I mean, success is a strong word, isn't it? But most of the activity on the channel has come from my one video where I tried to sell my ACEOs, art cards, editions and originals, and I made smart cards and tried to sell them on eBay and failed. And that's where 13,000 of my views have come from, that one video. And the rest of my videos hover somewhere between 20 views and a few hundred on the more successful end. So yes, good. I didn't actually think I'd make it to 500 by now, so, and I haven't yet, but you know, leave a question, ask me anything. I'll pretend I'm a YouTube celebrity and, you know, fake it till you make it, I guess. And until next week, I'll see you next time.